All right, welcome to the third lesson in chapter 4. In the second lesson, we talked about the role of the state. And actually, we're going to continue a little bit in that vein, and we're going to talk about a very specific policy that the government made. It's named the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956, or in short form, we'll just call it IPR 1956. Now, what is IPR 1956? Well, there were three principal elements of this policy, but the policy itself was designed to ensure that India would achieve economic growth while at the same time maintaining social justice. Now, if you look at India today in 2017, we can kind of assess, has India really maintained a high level of social justice? I think that's one of the things you should be asking yourself so that we can see, in fact, if this policy was able to achieve those goals. How did they go about ensuring social justice? Well, as I mentioned earlier, there are three core elements. The first being threefold classification of industries. Secondly, industrial licensing. And thirdly, the book calls it industrial SOPs. But frankly speaking, I've never heard of this terminology before. So I'm going to refer to it as industrial concessions, which is what it is known as throughout the rest of the world. So let's talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. So first, we're going to talk about the threefold classification of industries. Well, what does that mean? Very, very simply, the Indian government allowed that industries were allowed to be classified only in one of three ways. The first being the private sector. In the private sector, the primary responsibilities of firms is such that they are designed to create profit and ensure that their ownerships have a return on their investment. The second type being the public sector. Those are operated by the government, and public sector firms are not primarily concerned with profitability. They are primarily concerned with achieving a specific purpose, whether it be providing education or providing healthcare. There are a number of things. We'll talk about them in detail later. And the last one is the mixed sector. What is a mixed sector? It's partially private, partially public. The very easy way to think of this is a partnership between some private owners and the government. So these are the three key elements of the Indian society's IPR 1956 threefold classification, that all firms must be separated into one of three sectors. Either they're private, public, or mixed. So let's talk about the second point here. The second point is industrial licensing. Now, what is industrial licensing? Well, industries are only established through licensing. And what this means is you have to apply to the government to be able to earn the right to do something. The reason why this was done is the Indian government wanted to control indiscriminate growth. So you might argue, for instance, Google and other firms today have indiscriminate growth. Apple's a good example. They're so huge. Apple has more cash on hand than any firm in the history of humanity. Now, that may not make much sense to you, but the way to think about it is this. A few years ago, when there was a Greek economic crisis, there were rumors that Apple was considering paying off the entire debt of Greece through its cash holdings. So if you can fathom how big that is, it's enormous. They could have saved an entire country just with their cash on hand. And the Indian government thought, hey, we don't want our firms to grow that big. And why is that? Very simply. If firms become too big and too strong, they can exert political power and they can probably put pressure on the market to reduce wages and reduce salaries. And the Indian government thought, hey, our primary objective here is to ensure social justice. So we have to control indiscriminate growth. The next was they wanted to ensure that firms would provide services to outlier areas in the rural regions of India. So oftentimes they would grant licenses to firms and ensure that they would produce in certain areas so that everybody in India would be able to access certain goods and services. And unbelievably also, the Indian government put in a restriction that says expansion also requires licensing. So if you want to grow your firm and if you want to get bigger, you have to apply for a license to be able to do so. Now we're going to talk about this in class, and we're going to discuss whether or not the firm should have set up industrial licensing and whether this was for the benefit of the Indian people or whether this was just for the benefit of the government so they would be able to control industries. Now finally, we're going to talk about industrial concession. Does the government of India directly control industries? Well, kind of, although the answer is directly no, because the Indian government issues licensing for firms and issues permits for certain companies to engage in certain activity, those firms are always at the behest of the government. They must do what the government says. So private entrepreneurship is encouraged, but concessions are given to certain firms. What does that mean? So, for example, let's say in a given region, there is no cotton production. Now, the government may say, okay, we want somebody to produce cotton in this industry because there's a vast amount of lands and cotton is not being harvested here because it's not profitable. People need to survive. They need to eat. So individuals are only producing goods which ensure their subsistence. For instance, they'll be producing food or searching for water. And as a result of that, they're not producing materials for the textile industry. The Indian government said, okay, if you are engaged in a very specific kind of industry, we will give you some benefits. For instance, we will allow tax holidays, which means you'll pay less tax. Or we will give you reduced energy rates so you can operate your firms at a lower cost. And this was done to spur growth in certain areas, but those firms then are dependent on government approval. And that is a kind of fuzzy situation. And some people argue that because of this, the market is not operating at its optimal performance because the market forces should dictate what gets produced, where it gets produced, and when it gets produced. But because of these government industrial concessions, firms are motivated to take action that without that concession would not be in their best interest. So what have we learned from the 1956 IPR? Well, we mentioned that this policy was designed to ensure social justice. So as a result, the government broke down all industries into one of three sectors, the private sector, the public sector, or a mixed sector. They ensured that firms had to obtain licensing, and the purpose of this was such that no firm could grow too big so that it would exert political power over the government or that it would be able to manipulate or decrease salaries or wages for workers in India, and a few other issues as well. And then finally, the industrial concessions, which were the government did certain things to ensure that firms would produce certain items or certain goods or services in certain areas at reduced costs of production. That's basically it for this section, but there's a lot of food for thought here.